Hello, your friendly neighborhood host JT Wheatley here again, back for another episode of the History of Comics podcast, this time with the life of Frank Miller. One of the most pivotal comic book creators in the 1980s and 90s is Frank Miller. After revamping Daredevil at Marvel in the early 1980s, he would move over to DC, where he created arguably the greatest Batman story ever in The Dark Knight Returns, and later revamped the character as well in Batman Year One. Soon, both Marvel, DC, and even Hollywood was calling, as he was quickly the most talented writer-artist and would soon set a new standard in gritty comic book storytelling. He would carry this into the 90s with independent work on Sin City and 300. As a result, Miller was one of the chief influences, for better or worse, for the dark, gritty storytelling that not only affects comic books, but film and TV to this day. Frank Miller was born in Only, Maryland on January 27, 1957, the fifth of 7 children to an Irish Catholic family. His family later moved to Montpelier, Vermont, where Miller grew up with his siblings, nurse mother, and carpenter-electrician father. Growing up, Miller was a longtime comic book fan and dreamed of being an artist from an early age, with his mother even commenting he once presented her with a rough comic book he made from stapled notebook paper. However, he would never have any formal training as an artist. As a fan, Miller did write a letter to Marvel Comics, which appeared in the Cat #3 in April of 1973. Growing up in Vermont, Miller also was fascinated by New York City, and when he finally got a chance to visit, he truly loved it. Frank Miller loved movies and detective fiction as well. This wasn't just for enjoyment, as Miller truly believed comic book artists should study other mediums and would influence his later comic book work. For Miller, he was especially a fan of film directors such as Stanley Kubrick and Alfred Hitchcock, and would call the book Hitchcock Truffaut, where the French New Wave director Francis Truffaut interviewed the British director Alfred Hitchcock on his films, as the best book for comic book artists to study. Miller did stop reading comic books in his early teens, but soon returned to them when he became serious about a career as a comic book artist. Miller would later work at an art gallery in Vermont, which introduced him to Japanese art and the print, which he noticed resembled comic book art in many ways, and also, of course, began to appeal to his love of visual Japanese manga. As for comic books specifically, Miller loved The Spirit by Will Eisner, along with artist Joe Kubrick, whom he called the granddaddy of comic book noir, and Gil Kane. He also upgraded better than other artists as Steve Ditko's Mr. A, along with artists like Johnny Craig, Wally Wood, Jack Kirby, and Max Fleischer's Superman cartoon. Miller especially loved Richard Corbin's Den as well from the Heavy Metal magazine. Frank Miller started out his career doing fanzines before finally meeting with noted comic book legend and artist Neil Adams in New York City, who immediately criticized his work. This would be about a year of Frank Miller going to New York City and back, getting criticized by Adams, and returning home to approve his work. Finally, he made a full commitment to his dream, moving to New York City permanently despite having little money. Adams did give Miller some basic instruction, though, such as doing location work for research for comic book settings, something that would come in handy for New York City. He also helped Frank Miller get his first job in 1978 after moving to New York City to break into the comic book business. Miller's first published work was by Western Publishing Gold Key Comics in Twilight Zone Stories, issue number 84 to 85, which appeared in June and July of 1978, with the 3-page story The Royal Feast in issue number 84, and the 5-page story The Endless Cloud in issue number 85. There were no publishing credits for the first story, but Miller would later state they weren't that good. He would later do Weird War Tales number 64 on June of 1978 at DC, which would be his first confirmed credit in the 6-page story Deliver Me from D-Day, which was written by Wyatt Gwynn and inked by Danny Bolandi. Miller would next do a two-page story in the World War Tales number 68 that October by writer Robert McKenzie, along with a 6-page story The Greatest Story Never Told by writer Paul Cooperberg in that same issue, and a 5-page story, The Edge of History by writer Elliot S. Magan in The Unknown Soldier number 219 on September 1978. Miller also reversed his first work for Marvel in John Carter, Warlord of Mars number 18 in November of 1978 with a 17-page story, The Master Assassin of Mars Part 3. Despite his work, Miller was living very much the life of a starving artist, often going days without food to get by until he got regular assignments. At Marvel, Miller became a regular fill-in artist, where he penciled 2 issues of Spectacular Spider-Man with issues number 27 to 28 on February to March of 1979. What was significant about these issues was that they guest starred Daredevil, and Miller enjoyed the character so much he requested Marvel's editor-in-chief Jim Shooter, through writer-editor Joe Duffy, to assign him to Daredevil's comic. This was perfect timing, as then current Daredevil artist Gene Colan had begged Shooter to be taken off the book. Plus, it helped that the sales were poor at the time, to the point that the comic was only published on a bi-monthly basis, thus putting on an unknown artist would be little risk. For Frank Miller, this was part of his larger plan, as when he first came to New York, most of his comic book art was crime influenced, with men wearing trench coats and carrying guns, as he described. The editor said that he liked them, but they asked, where are the guys in tights? Realizing this, Miller trained himself to draw superheroes, but with Daredevil, he was going to finally do his crime comic book, but one that just happened to star a superhero. Originally, Miller worked on Daredevil with writer Roger McKenzie, while Denny O'Neil served as editor, his first issue being issue number 158 on May of 1979. Neil Adams' early advice was to do location research paid off, as Miller brought New York City alive in Daredevil, as he would put it. Most people saw New York City as the Empire State Building and the Brooklyn Bridge, but there is more to the city than that, from the docks to the alleyways. Miller did admit to making changes to the cityscape to serve his artistic needs, and sometimes he wished he was drawing Gotham City over New York City, as he would have more freedom. With his new artistic style, Frank Miller was quickly considered one of Marvel's new rising stars, but sales did not improve, and Marvel was thinking about canceling Daredevil outright. At the same time, Miller was frustrated with McKenzie's scripts and thinking about quitting the comic as well. However, Miller would write and draw the backup story in Daredevil, and that impressed editor Denny O'Neil so much, he moved Roger McKenzie to another assignment while giving Frank Miller full writer-artist duties on Daredevil, issue number 168, on January of 1981. It was this issue that truly began Miller's epic run on Daredevil, as it was also where he delivered the first full comic book appearance of the femme fatale and Daredevil's former girlfriend, Elektra. Frank Miller created Elektra to be Daredevil's femme fatale, as he thought superheroes should have cooler girlfriends. She actually made her first appearance on the cover of the Comics Journal number 58, and Miller would later write and draw a solo adventure of her in Bizarre Adventures number 28 on October of 1981. This wasn't new, though, as Miller admits to Elektra being inspired by Will Eisner's The Spirit's own femme fatale, Sans Sharif, from the classic Will Eisner comic, to the point that he ripped off her first story from the first Sharif story. The character became so popular in Daredevil that some fans complained that she was taking over the book, joking that the comic was now Elektra co-starring Daredevil. Miller would always counter that Daredevil always drove the story, including Elektra's part in it. Her weapon of choice were sais, which are solid steel martial arts knives, and they were also deliberate. They are used to amplify one's strength, as Miller wanted Elektra to be not as physically strong as Daredevil, but just as capable thanks to her fighting skills. While Miller did expand on Daredevil's world, he would try to keep him separate from the rest of the Marvel Universe as much as possible. Elektra also placed a hand in revamping Daredevil's origin, as he was a member of the ninja clan The Hand, which was the rival clan to the Chaste, led by Stick, who was also blind, and Stick is revealed to have trained the young Matt Murdock to use his enhanced senses along with martial arts after his accident that blinded him. On his run on Daredevil, Miller would defer to the character's enhanced senses, making them more abstract, and when he journeyed across the city, he made a point to have him climb over swinging like Spider-Man. Miller later found out that swinging through the city was physically impossible. Miller very much liked Daredevil's blindness and human vulnerabilities, as he stated at the time he thought that Superman was boring in being so powerful. He would also take a fleeting reference to Hell's Kitchen in one of the earlier Daredevil comics to remake his origin entirely, starting with issue number 168, ultimately making it Daredevil's Gotham City. Miller started to make the comic more violent as well, much of it influenced when he was mugged twice while living in New York City, which changed his mood about comic books and life in general. Reportedly, he was planning a more lighthearted run before the crimes against him influenced the whole deal. Miller retconned Murdoch's relationship with his father, adding an incident where his father hit him as a young boy in anger when Matt returned from a schoolyard fight. It was not meant to show that Murdoch's father was abusive, but angry that his son was going down the same path that he was, wanting something more from Matt. Frank Miller also wanted to return the character to his roots, emphasizing his blindness and being a lawyer. This would influence Daredevil's moral code in that, as a lawyer, he genuinely believes in law and order, and thus will not take a life because he doesn't regard that as his decision. This was in contrast to the Punisher, a Marvel character who would make frequent appearances during his run on Daredevil, along with what Miller believed at the time Batman, who wanted criminals dead. Miller would even describe the Punisher as Batman without the lies. Frank Miller's run on Daredevil became an instant success, to the point that the 3 issues into Miller taking over as writer, the series went from bi-monthly to monthly. However, this increased workload put stress on Miller, who started to rely more on Klaus Johnson's inks, as Miller was delivering looser pencils by issue number 173. By issue number 185, he had virtually turned over the art chores to Johnson so that he could focus more on writing. All the while, Daredevil took on darker and more mature themes, climaxing with issue number 181 in April of 1982, in which Daredevil's arch-enemy Bullseye killed Elektra, which is still one of the most shocking deaths in comic history, despite her getting better in later years. Miller would finish his run on Daredevil with issue number 191 on February of 1983, a powerful issue that finds Daredevil playing a game of Russian roulette with Bullseye while he's incapacitated in the hospital, answering the question if he ever would kill him. A powerful story and the perfect end of Miller's epic run on Daredevil, he still considers it one of the best issues he's ever done. After completing his run on Daredevil, Frank Miller had risen from an unknown artist to a true superstar in the business, with, of course, Marvel's chief rival DC coming a courting. He had previously worked with DC before, notably on a short Batman story, One in Santa Claus, Dead or Alive, with writer Denny O'Neil in DC Specials number 21 in spring of 1980, which would be the first time he ever worked on Batman, another character he would soon revamp. O'Neil also worked on as well in 1980 and 81 in Amazing Spider-Man Annuals, which also featured Doctor Strange and the Punisher. After completing his run on Daredevil, Frank Miller turned his sights on another Marvel character when he penciled the Wolverine miniseries with writer Chris Claremont writing, which ran from September to December of 1982 for 4 issues, being the first solo series for the popular X-Men character. The story followed Wolverine journeying to Japan to track down his love, Mariko Sasade, only to have to deal with her criminal father along with his own feral nature. The series was an immediate critical and commercial success, further cementing Miller's reputation as one of the comic book's top artists, along with leading to Wolverine getting a regular comic book series. It also added Wolverine's Japanese past and struggle with honor, which would become a cornerstone to his character from henceforth. With this success, it was no surprise DC tried to recruit Frank Miller away from Marvel, which they did when Miller started developing his own creator-owned series, Ronin, which was inspired by his research in martial arts and samurai when developing Daredevil's martial arts background. According to Marvel and editor Jim Shooter, Ronin was supposed to be published under the Marvel graphic novels banner, but DC president Jeanette Kahn lured Miller away with the promise of greater freedom and higher quality paper for his comic book. As a result, Ronin was published as a 6-issue miniseries by DC from July of 1983 to August of 1984, telling the tale of an ancient samurai battling a demon into the future, combining feudal Japan with cyberpunk storytelling. The comic would be another critical and commercial success. It would later influence his work as the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, whose creators Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird also heavily referenced Miller's Daredevil run, along with Samurai Jack. The high-quality paper in Ronin also did a great job in highlighting the colorist Lynn Varney's work, and she would later marry Miller in 1986, beginning a long personal professional partnership. It was so significant that Frank Miller was named DC's 50 Who Made DC Great in 1985, which commemorated the company's 50th anniversary. However, Miller was only getting started at DC, as he was about to take the character for which the company is indirectly named after and remake him for the modern age. During this time, Frank Miller was worried about the comic book industry going more to the shops over newsstands, with the audience getting older as a result. This worried Miller, as he thought it was going to lead the audience to getting smaller and thus committing suicide. He especially didn't like the company was busy competing with one another instead of expanding the market in general. Miller also noticed during his run on Daredevil that Marvel's editorial mandates and the Comics Code Authority were indistinguishable, and that the code was more or less ineffective, pointing out the most restrictive company, Gold Key, didn't even use it. Frank Miller would move to Los Angeles with his move to D.C. Miller said after living in New York City for 8 years, he found it to be repressive in prompting the move. Plus, he joked, the weather is much better. Overall, Frank Miller felt liberated by his move to D.C. and Los Angeles and was ready to produce arguably his greatest work to date. After Ronin, his original plan was to revamp DC's Trinity, Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman, with writer Steve Gerber. Originally, the two creators came together with different ideas, ultimately with a pitch to DC for Man of Steel, which was going to be Superman. The Amazon, a revamp of Wonder Woman, and The Dark Knight, which of course would be a revamp of the Batman. While the first two weren't produced, the last one became the basis for arguably Frank Miller's greatest work, The Dark Knight Returns. Frank Miller started on The Dark Knight Returns in 1985, working with editor Dick Giordano on the story, which he said took about 4 or 5 drafts to get to. Miller also reportedly took advice from other comic book creators, such as for John Byrne, who stated that the new Robin should be a girl, along with the inspiration from the Dirty Harry film Sudden Impact, which had the franchise character returning after a long convalescence. In The Dark Knight Returns, it tells the story of a 55-year-old Bruce Wayne who has retired from being Batman for over 10 years after the death of Jason Todd. However, Gotham City is now a dystopian crime zone, which prompts Wayne to redon the cape and cowl to fight for justice, all while recruiting a new Robin and Carrie Kelly and facing off against a revived Joker. Told over a 4-issue prestige limited series, it used glossy paper to further highlight the colorist Lynn Volley's watercolors. It was released from February through June of 1986. Giordano would leave the project halfway through due to production delays, but ultimately was released is now considered one of the greatest Batman stories ever made, if not the best one ever. Its reception was especially jarring considering the public at the time was still used to the Batman as the campy version from the 1960s Adam West TV show. This Batman was anything but, breaking bones and using guns, while the story in general also poked fun at politics and psychology across the board. Both Ronald Reagan and the media were targets. Despite its then unheard-of price of $2.95 an issue, it sold in nearly 1 million copies and is today considered one of the greatest comic book stories ever told, and it's in my personal top 5. The influence of The Dark Knight Returns can't be easily dismissed either, as both it and The Watchmen by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons that same year ushered in a dark and gritty take on comic books, something that all the creators mentioned and protested against. While there had been darker takes on Batman before, from the original stories by Bob Kang and Bill Finger to the acclaimed 1970s run by Neil Adams and Denny O'Neil, this truly set a new standard for the character and has influenced nearly every incarnation since. From the 1989 Batman film, which is an early version of the script, had Batman riding a horse like in the comic, to the more recent Batman v Superman, Dawn of Justice in 2016, in which director Zack Snyder brought the cover to the first issue to life on screen. The comic would even have a direct adaptation with The Dark Knight Returns animated film in 2012 and 2013, a 2-part adventure that had Peter Weller voice Bruce Wayne and Batman, and Michael Emerson voiced the Joker. The film was instantly acclaimed for its faithfulness to the stories, and even Frank Miller's art style, especially in splitting the film in 2 parts to fully adapt it. To date, it remains one of the most popular of the DC animated films. After The Dark Knight Returns, Frank Miller returned to Daredevil as a writer with the self-contained story in issue number 219 on June of 1985 with art by John Buscema, and then co-wrote issue number 226 in January 1986 with the departing Denny O'Neil. Then, Frank Miller teamed with artist David Mazzucchelli for Daredevil Born Again, a 7-issue arc that ran from issues number 227 to 233 on February to August of 1986, which had Daredevil dealing with the ramifications of his arch nemesis, the Kingpin, learning his secret identity and using that knowledge to destroy him. The series not only dealt with Matt Murdock Daredevil's Catholicism, but also the mystery of his missing mother, and today is considered one of the greatest Daredevil stories ever told, further cementing Miller's take on the character to the point that many consider it his definitive version, despite the character being created by comic book greats Stan Lee and Bill Everett. To date, nearly every adaptation of Daredevil in any other medium, from Ben Affleck movie to the Netflix series, references Miller's take on the character. While also doing Daredevil Born Again, Frank Miller teamed with artist Bill Sienkiewicz for Daredevil Love and War, a graphic novel that bridged the gap between Frank Miller's original run on Daredevil and Born Again, explaining the Kingpin's changed attitude on the character. The writer-artist pairing then produced Elektra Assassin, an 8-issue miniseries under Marvel's Epic imprint that was set outside its regular continuity. As a result, it featured crazy plot twists like cyborgs and ninjas, all while expanding on Elektra's background. Despite its crazy plot, Elektra would be a hit with the fans and critics. Elektra Assassin required more writing to get the visuals down, with each issue rewritten several times to do so. Miller was especially impressed with Sienkiewicz's art ability, especially in the flashback sequences of Elektra's childhood, which he deliberately drew to resemble child drawings. Today, it is considered another classic by Frank Miller, even if it's a bit more eccentric of the character. Frank Miller then returned to DC and Batman, reteaming with artist David Musicelli for Batman Year One, which ran from February to May of 1987 and Batman number 404 to 407. Part of DC's larger revamp of their heroes after the Crisis of Infinite Earths, the story retells Batman's origin as a parallel to the Jim Gordon coming to Gotham City and dealing with the corruption of the police department. The comic would be controversial in its depiction of Catwoman, who not only starts out as a prostitute, but dresses in an S&M outfit, which would later be retconned out in Zero Hour and the New 52, something DC has done quite a lot of. Overall, the story is considered another high mark for Batman and Frank Miller. While it didn't reach the heights of The Dark Knight Returns, it remains one of the most popular stories from both Batman and DC. Naturally, DC would follow up the concept with Year 2 and Year 3 stories, which Frank Miller had no involvement in, while the comic itself would be the chief inspiration for Christopher Nolan's Batman Begins movie of 2005, which launched the acclaimed Dark Knight movie trilogy. Frank Miller previously was contracted to adapt Year One into a movie itself with director Darren Aronofsky, though that would fall apart due to creative differences between the two, with Miller even stating that Aronofsky's vision of Batman is darker than his. Reportedly, the script had Batman rejecting his wealth and living as a bum. Batman Year One was eventually adapted as part of the DC Films line in 2011, featuring Benjamin McKenzie as the voice of Bruce Wayne Batman, Bryan Cranston as Jim Gordon, and Elijah Dushku as Selina Kyle Catwoman. It received near universal acclaim for its faithfulness to the comic, along with the voice acting, notably Cranston's performance as Gordon. A fun note, Ben McKenzie would later play Jim Gordon in the Gotham TV show from 2014 to 2019, which also used Batman Year One as an influence. With this and The Dark Knight Returns, Frank Miller put his stamp on Batman like he did on Daredevil, with more than a few fans praising his version of The Dark Knight as the best version ever. Despite his busy work schedules, Miller still found time to provide covers for the first comic's English translation reprints of the classic manga Lone Wolf and Cub by Kazuo Kogoki and Kozuko Kojima, one of his favorites and a chief influence in many of his works, notably Ronin. With this success, Frank Miller started to be more outspoken about dealing with censorship, especially on Daredevil Born Again and Batman Year One. In both cases, Miller protested against the company's meddling and particularly hated the rating system that DC President Jeanette Kahn wanted to implement. His argument was that books don't have ratings, why should comics? Miller even stated that children should be allowed to find out what they wanted and didn't even believe in parental advisories, which led to him writing a letter to the Comics Journal for issue number 97 on April of 1985. That's not to say it was just right-wing hatred, as Miller hated liberals who promoted censorship as well, such as the Women Against Pornography. He even signed a petition with Alan Moore, Howard Chaykin, Lin Wein, and numerous other creators in protest, which ran in the Comics Buyer's Guide. For Miller, the biggest fear wasn't that Marvel and DC would implement a rating system, as he would just not work with the companies in protest. His worry was that the retailers would follow suit and oppose a rating system on all the other publishers as well. As a result of the protests, DC dropped its rating system, but it still drove Miller away from the company for a while, as he decided to pursue independent, creator-owned work, and even a try at Hollywood. And we will leave you with the life of Frank Miller with that, but when we come back, we will get into Miller making his try at both independent and creator work, and also his ups and downs with the Hollywood system. And now it is January 1st, 2026, and, well, first off, Happy New Year, everyone. Another great year to be alive and enjoying comic books. Hopefully we get a lot of fun comic books today, and one is my favorite comic book, well, last week, as pointed out, because New Year's Eve and Christmas Eve both fell on New Comic Book Day. A lot of my comic book store, like a lot of stores, closed early. Was able to get there in time to pick up my books. So this is what I got last week. And last week was Void Rivals number 25 by Robert Kirkman and Andrea Bresson, which is the first part of the Quintesson War, which for those familiar with the Transformers know that the Quintessons are a fairly big deal in the Transformers mythos, as they show up to give the Void Rivals some problems, especially when Solar is still being held captive by what's considered like the god of the Void Rival universe, while Derek is trying to make peace with both sides. Just when, like I said, the Quintessons show up, and looks like all hell's about to break loose. So Kirkman does a great job balancing this crazy sci-fi story and finding that this is an original story that fits into the Transformers mythos. And of course, we got a little bit of Cobra Law from G.I. Joe as well, which is a very nice twist because it's kind of interesting to see where you have this the Transformers, which are based on technology, and Cobra Law, which is based on biology, and they're going against each other. So it'll be a fun thing to see where that goes. And Andrea Bresson's art is gorgeous, great sci-fi landscapes and characters and so forth. So just a great, unique read. Great book, and the overall Energon universe. Kind of one of the more underrated ones, even though this is what launched the whole Energon universe that's currently running right now, but it's still well worth checking out. And of course, with that, once again, Happy New Year again. Hope we have another great year of reading great comic books, creating new comic books. I don't believe in New Year's resolutions. I believe if you don't wait till next year to do something, do it now. And believe it or not, I am still making new episodes. I'm still working on that. I want to have a solid 10 before I drop anymore. But we're listening to archives and maybe doing some updates and so forth, and go with that. But till then, once again, have a happy New Year again. And go out and enjoy yourself a good comic book, and definitely check out the Void Rivals. It's the start of the Energon universe, and it's still pretty darn good to read.